everybody. Welcome to another edition of Writers Drinking Whiskey, your literary happy hour, the show where we eschew all standards of safety and jump headfirst into harm's way. I am your host and resident object lesson, William R. Hincy, and joining me today, I am honored and thrilled, and as great-grandma Babs used to say, over the moon, to have John Gilstrap with me. John, welcome to the Whiskey Bar.
Thanks very much. Can't imagine any place I'd rather be.
So very good. That kind of leads me. So I want to give you the brief intro. You have an illustrious career, so I think people will be able to find you, fairly easily. But I do want to give you your, I forget what the kids call it now. It's not credits anymore. Your flowers. I have to give you your flowers, is what my teenage kids tell me. Yeah, I have to give. So prolific author, obviously, New York Times bestselling. You had, I think it all started with like Nathan's Run, and then At All Cost, both of which were bestsellers and then got optioned. You've had several books, I think, optioned, generally. Prior to that, though, you were also an expert, and I like to use that word just, willy-nilly, I might even say master or virtuoso. But that was with explosive safety and hazardous waste. You manage your own consulting firm. And then after even you reached every author's dream, right? To like support yourself with what you're writing, you still went back and worked for a time as a director of safety for it was a trade association, I believe.
That's right.
Right. Awesome. And then the new book is Harm's Way, which is hence my bombastic little intro to the show. I like to bring things in. So safety, Harm's Way,
I caught that. Just so you know, I saw what you did there.
Good. Awesome. So, and anyone that's not familiar with your work, you're going to get a sternly worded letter for one, and anyone under 25, a letter is physical email. I'm going to be sending that to you in the mail, or you can just Google him, and his website's really amazing. Great, but I love actually your website because there's so much information. Sometimes they're very light, sometimes they're not organized well, but yours was really organized and had tons of information and funny little tidbits where you chime in. So that's
good to hear. All the content is mine. All the design belongs to someone else. I'm a computer Luddite.
Sure. Awesome. So before we move on, anything you want to add to that? Anything I might have missed?
No, I think that pretty much does it. The whole business of being an expert with explosives just means I have all 10 fingers. So that's the proof.
Right. Very good. Very good. Awesome. So the question I love to start with here is where in the world are you, and where's the best place to get a drink there?
Okay. Where in the world am I? I am in Berkeley County, West Virginia, which is the mountain state, wild and wonderful. I grew up in the DC suburbs, and we moved out here. We built our dream house and moved out here about 2 years ago, and it's spectacular. The nights are scary dark. Like you can get lost at the end of your driveway trying to find a house, which is my preference, and so impossibly quiet. It's just lovely. Best place to get a drink. Well, there's two of them. One, if I'm going to, let's start at the house. When we built this house, I'm an Irish Catholic, and I come from an Irish Catholic family. So be true to thyself. So rather than building a living room, you walk in my front door into the tavern. And the tavern is, it's as well stocked as yours. You don't have a lot of clear liquors. I like gin and vodka, but also the dark liquors. And I'm actually a pretty good little bartender. So that's a fine place. And there's a town nearby here called Shepherdstown, and there's a couple of good bars down there. One is a Rathskeller at the Bavarian Inn, which is exactly what it's right on the nose description of it. But you go down, it's really like being in Germany. It's the low ceilings, kind of close, and the bartender there is spectacular. And there's another place called the Press Room, which is a little more trendy. You're more likely to see the hip and happening people at the Press Room than you will at the Rathskeller. But both are really cool places.
Both very cool. How far is that from like Wheeling?
Oh, a long way from Wheeling.
It's a long way.
It's probably 3 or 4 hours. We are about an hour and 20 minutes from Dulles Airport. So we're very much in the Eastern Panhandle.
Okay, very good. Yeah, because my family so I was born in Morgantown,
Okay.
which I've brutalized on the show so many times. I finally learned to say it. I would always call it Morgan's Town. But I was born in Morgantown where WVU is and such. And my family we're actually the other panhandle. So we'd be I guess the
Northern
Western
Panhandle.
panhandle. Is that yeah, it'd be northern too. But yeah, so that's where everybody is. My grandparents still live in West Alexander, PA, which is right on the border with West Virginia. In fact, my grandfather was a farmer, so it used to drive him nuts. He's like, if I was just 5 minutes that way, the taxes would be so much better, you know. And he had operated the farm and dumped it in West Virginia. He would have in a second. Awesome. So moving on from where you are. Oh, you know what? The one question I love to ask too. So, and maybe you haven't been there long enough to answer this, but I always wonder, like, what's the most I like to say thrilling for thriller writers, but just what's the most kind of interesting thing to ever happen there?
Here, probably John Brown's raid. That was Jefferson County, but that's Harper's Ferry is not 10 miles from here. That was pretty exciting. A lot of history happened here. West Virginia wasn't West Virginia until the Civil War. So this was part of Virginia, and this is where, you know, everything from the signing of the Declaration of Independence through the Civil War, a lot of that happened around here.
Sure. Very cool. And so then I went through, like I mentioned, kind of pregame here, and people are going to catch on to my tactics as I go to people's websites and I just read about them in their own words. And so then it gives me lots of questions to ask you, you know, so it's my cheat code, you know.
Oh, there you go. I write fiction. If you can cheat and make it easy, I'm all over it.
Very good. So I'll start just with high school briefly to touch on it, because there was one bit that I really loved, was that you were with the high school newspaper and that you quit because it was something with the First Amendment. It was a lofty First Amendment ideal, and you quit the newspaper. So I wonder if you could tell us what the issue was with the First Amendment.
In retrospect, it probably wasn't a First Amendment issue, but that's how I couched it at the time. I went to Robinson Secondary School, and we had there was a column that it wouldn't be Robinson if, you know, in ellipses. And then it was just rumored stuff, you know, if Marilee Burdan didn't kiss Steve Bain, if such and such, you know, it's just kind of that granular kind of gossip mongering, the secrets that really weren't secret. And we got a new sponsor that year, and her husband apparently was a lawyer and thought that exposed us to too much liability. And so therefore they canceled the most popular column in the school newspaper. And I went on, I was the editor, editor in chief. I forget what I was called, but I was the top dog, a student. And I just fell on my sword, you know, that we're not, I will not be dictated this way. And I quit. Somehow the newspaper continued without me, and the column stayed canceled.
Very good. It's like the scene in Jerry Maguire, right? Like, who's coming with me? And like one person. Right, exactly.
It's a very lonely place all of a sudden. Come on, guys.
That's awesome. And so then kind of out of high school, you ended up going into the volunteer fire department. I think that was in Virginia, right? Fairfax County.
Right. Well, there was college in between, but yes.
Oh, okay. And what drew you into to volunteer for the fire department?
I was through college. I spent my summers working at a summer camp for overprivileged rich children, and there was a kid named John. I won't mention his last name because I don't know that he'd want me to. But it was after 4 years of working there. This was my last day of my last year. I'd already graduated from college, and John ran out onto a busy road. The campus was, I don't know how many acres it was. It was a lot, but it fronted on a busy road. And I don't know why he did it, but John ran out into the road and he got hit hard by a car doing about 35, 40 miles an hour. And it broke his femur, it fractured his pelvis, it ruptured his bladder, it bruised his liver. I mean, he was really, really screwed up. And I was the first one there. And it was my responsibility, by the way. And I had no idea what to do. You know, here you have this kid, he's suffering, he's bleeding. Clearly his leg is not facing the way it's supposed to. And the good news is, you know, lo, these many years later, he's okay. He lived through the experience, had some, you know, physical therapy, which orthopedic surgery in 1979 is not what it is, today. Sure. And I just vowed that that's never happened to me again. You know, I never want to have that hopeless feeling. So I ended up signing up with a local community college. I already had my degree, and I took a EMT class and became a nationally registered emergency medical technician, which then leads kind of organically into the fire department. And I rode, fire. There weren't rescue squads per se where I was. So it was a fire department. You rode the ambulance or the fire truck. And equally, depends on what the call was. So over the time, I sort of evolved more onto the fire side than the EMS side. Got tired of being puked on. And, but that's how I did that for 14 years. I worked, the volunteer fire department I worked with ran 14,000 calls a year. Wow. Which is a lot of calls. Somebody told me, I don't know if it's true or not. I never bothered to verify, but I was told we were the busiest fire station in Virginia. In retrospect, I have a hard time believing that, but that's what we were told.
Mm-hmm, sure. Yeah, that's amazing. Was there anything, and I mean, I completely get the experience of it. We had a sadder outcome. We were driving one day, my wife and I, and came across a lady who had gotten, and I'm an avid bike rider. So, but a lady was riding her bike and got hit by a car. And we got there, she was already passed. She's just in the road though. So my wife's a nurse. So we got, but I had that same kind of helpless feeling, and it was helpless because she had already passed, but there was also, even if she hadn't, I didn't know what to do. And that's when I was like, I probably won't, volunteer, but I was like, I at least want to know what to do if this happens and I'm out, And
at a stage like that, actually priorities change, right? Because you can't, presuming you knew that she was dead, I won't ask how you would know, but we'll accept that. Now you have to decide, how do I protect me? How do I protect anybody else who might run into this scene? So you sort of transition into the larger emergency management scene. Uh-huh. And if you don't know how to do that, or if your head's not in that space, it becomes overwhelming really, really quickly.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. So thanks. Was there anything with it? Just in general, because going through, so was all of it, because then you went on to be a director for safety and such, like we mentioned in the intro, was all of it related to that event, or was there also just some there's a lot of service to others, right? Like if you look at your CV, as our corporate, I'm still corporate. Was there anything else that there's that idea of being a service to others, or was it mostly just coming from that event?
No, I think it's evolutionary, right? You get involved in the fire service, as I mentioned, and then you get addicted to the adrenaline rush of that. And by comparison, my job, I work for a magazine that reported on the construction industry. It was terrible. I mean, just horrible experience. If you haven't worked for a drunk, you haven't really had a good time. And so that was miserable. So my day job compared to the volunteer job, which literally paid nothing, sort of by definition, that really got out of balance. And I found out that there was a thing called a safety engineer. Who knew? And as luck would have it, University of Southern California had an outreach or an extension here in Northern Virginia, Crystal City, outside DC. So I enrolled there in their Institute of Safety and Systems Management, and I ended up ultimately getting a master's degree. But while I was in that course, I met a guy who hired me to be the safety manager for an explosives manufacturing plant. So, and from there, because of mistakes in the company's past, I became an expert on hazardous waste really quickly and in exactly the wrong way. And under the wrong circumstances. So, it's kind of a continuum. I never planned out my career at all. And in retrospect, I certainly never thought that I was training to write thrillers the whole time. Right. The explosives, the fires, the danger, the camaraderie, all that kind of stuff, and it just kind of fed into what became a writing career.
Right, right. Was there any, because I know when we were scheduling this, you were at the, I'm blanking on the convention's name, but it was a shooting convention, the SHOT Show. Yeah, I guess that should have been an easy one. It was the shooting convention.
Shooting, hunting, and outdoor technology. It's a rather tortured acronym, but yes.
Very good. Was that always something you were interested in even back then, or was that something that also grew over time?
Firearms and that sort of thing. That goes way back, and things that go boom. In fact, when I was in the fire department, the big firecrackers, M80s, and those things were all illegal. So around the 4th of July, the fire marshal, of course, he's going around, he's confiscating all of these things and giving stern warnings, and then he'd bring them all to the fire station, and we'd set them off there, which was yet another benefit.
Was there people that learned that and just started like lining up like they do for like the high schools that say,
yeah, exactly.
God, that's hilarious. So you went to USC, was that a remote one, or were you out here?
Yes. And I think it's very interesting. I get the annual letter where I contribute to my alma mater and the library I loved so much. And I've never set foot on the campus. I have no idea where it is or what it looks like, but I do have the degree. It's on the wall right over there.
Mm-hmm. Well, USC is funny because where it is, and it used to be talked about a lot, but there was South Central LA. Like, so when I was growing up, that was like, oh, you don't go to South Central. And then that was the dangerous.
Wasn't that the Rodney King riot place? Wasn't that South Central?
Yeah, that was right around South Central. That's where all that happened. And so USC is actually right next to it, but it is like this little bubble of like rich safety. You just go. So it is. I mean, LA is a very interesting city. There's parts that are very nice, and then parts to where you feel like you're at a fourth world country, and you just literally just cross and you're there, and it's suddenly rampant homelessness and things, and you're just like, it's just, you see the economy, and you just kind of almost like when you step like a state line or something, you're like, I'm in Nevada, I'm in California right here, right? It's kind of like that. It's like I'm in some other world, and you're probably better off having not stepped foot there.
And by comparison, it's interesting that before we moved here, I lived in Fairfax County, Virginia, which is a big suburb outside of DC. There are 1.2 million people who live in Fairfax County. There are 110,000 people living in Berkeley County, where I am, which is the same footprint. And there's 1.7 million in the entire state of West Virginia. Right. So, you've got the difference between people all compacted together and occupying the same space. And here, everything is 20 minutes, half hour away, but you don't pass another car when you're on the way. So it took us a while to get used to it, simply because it's so quiet. When you, it's a big transition, having come from, I was never living in a city, but kind of the city came out to live with me as we were in Fairfax, and move out here. It's a big change. So if I go to a place like LA or New York or any of the big cities now, or even Vegas, where I was for the SHOT Show, it's not unsettling because I did it for a long time, but the difference is becoming more and more profound.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, I believe it. And so then, I guess, getting back to your career trajectory here. So you graduate, USC. That was the master's, I think, right? And then so you get the master's. I'm sure there's some machinations, but you end up having a consulting firm, and then that's also where the first book sells. So Nathan's Run, and it sells like gangbusters. It gets optioned. The second one does great too. What was that period of time of your life like?
That slice when Nathan's Run sold was bizarre. Quite honestly, when I was a general manager of a division of chemical waste management, which was part of waste management. Before it was broken up, back in the late 80s, early 90s, it was just a behemoth of the trash and hazardous waste business. And when it started to go bad for a number of reasons, I ended up essentially buying away my division and starting a separate company called Compliance Services. And because of the timing of such, it was just an incredible deal, pennies on the dollar. And I had all of the old customers. So, start a new business with a big customer list.
Right.
And the itch for writing was always there. I was always, I call it a closet writer. And when I don't know how many employees I had at the time. It was more than a few. And I was president of the company, and I was writing in my spare time and on the weekends. And when I was done with what became Nathan's Run, there were 3 books before that I never tried to do anything with. They were just writing exercises. I realized that I had something. I thought it was as good. I'm an avid reader, a voracious reader. And I thought it was as good as anything that I had read. And so I started trying to find an agent, because this is 1994. And so we're talking stamps and hard copies, and,
Sure.
it's everything happened in slow motion.
Right.
And after I got 27 rejections, which also sort of becomes, okay, you go to the mailbox, there's another thin letter. Well, I know what this is going to be. Right. And, but it wasn't important to me to get published. I thought it'd be cool, but I had a job, and I had responsibilities. I had a young family and all that to take care of. So on February 23rd, 1995, my phone rang, and this was a lady saying, hello, doll. She's about a 24 pack a day, cigarette smoker. Hello, doll. My name is Molly. And I love your book. I want to represent you. Is that okay? And I said, of course. And 2 days later, March 1st. No, that was March. Anyway, it doesn't matter. That was February 23rd. She called on March 1st. She called and said that, she had gotten a book deal, and it was a 2-book deal for $250,000. And, whoa. And she said, so of course I turned it down. Huh? and then she came back. With the real deal was a 1-book deal for a lot more. And so what was it like? I hung up the phone. I was at the office. I was working late, and of course, so my wife is at home with our boy. I guess he was 7 or 8 years old at that point. And so I called her and I said, we got an offer on the book. And I told her the number, and she said, no. I mean, yeah, it's a good book, but let's be honest, John, it's not that good. so I had to arrange a conference call, which was a big deal in 1995, because you had to go through a third party. And so it was a conference call with Molly at her office in New York through my phone to tell Joy that, yes, this is real. It's not a joke. It will still be real tomorrow when we wake up. And then it was a couple of days later, we got the movie deal for it. So,
wow.
It's well over $1 million in 3-4 days. So what's that like? It makes you a little bit dizzy. It makes you a little bit giddy. And it's not something that you can process, quite honestly. It's just,
sure.
And it becomes now sort of all encompassing. And, you're dealing with interviews from People magazine and from, it's this sort of bizarre out of nowhere experience. And I realized by looking at the balance sheet that I was no longer paying attention to the business. So
Sure.
I ended up selling the business to the employees at a very reasonable price. And I just wanted to be done with it. It's why get in their way? And when this is really, the writing thing is really what I wanted to do. So it was a pretty spectacular time. Sure.
Was there almost like a shock to it? Or, something happens, you just can't process it. Like it's just...
Yeah. I mean, I think, was that I don't know. I remember waking up, this might've been after the movie deal, because I think that happened on a Friday. Waking up in the morning and turning to my wife and saying, this happened, right? This isn't just a dream. This actually happened. And then it's, been a rocket ship ride, actually more of a roller coaster, but it's been a hell of a ride ever since.
Sure. Was there, because you had written the 1 book, and I know you wrote the 3 before that You described it writing exercises, right? So was there pressure then on that second book? Was that harder to do, or were you able to still kind of get in your bubble and just write that?
It was hard to the extent that now there's this lightning strike, right? My first book is sort of at the pinnacle of what other people spend a career trying to get to. And I didn't know why. What is it about? Is it the story? Is it, why would they do this? There are way more talented writers than I am that aren't nearly, getting nearly that check. So I started to overthink it, and that's creatively constipating. And finally, it was Joy, my wife, who said, John, consider the fact that they just like your way of telling a story. So tell another story. And I kind of freed things up. And At All Costs, which is the second book, also, turned out really well. And one in a row is not a trend. Two in a row is almost a trend. And then, so at that point, I didn't sell the company until after At All Costs came out. So there was enough time to do real damage by having my eye off the ball. And, that was 1995 and 1996.
Very good. And so then that's when you sell the company, and then you're writing full time. And then, and I think it was your wife on your bio called it your big boy job.
Yes.
And you decided you wanted to go back to the big boy job. This was, maybe you could walk us through that process a little bit.
Sure. There was the writing career was a roller coaster at the beginning. Like I said, the advances that they paid me were so stratospheric. The book sold really well, and they made the bestseller list and all that, but they never made enough money to earn out the advance, which is a good way to earn disfavor from the publisher. It's always the writer's fault. It's the entertainment business, right? So it's always the artist's fault. And that's just the way it is. That's not bitterness. It's just the way it is. So I was set financially. There wasn't, except for the rest of our lives. And, but creatively, it was less fulfilling because, you get the adrenaline isn't quite as high once the reality sets in that there are consequences. And so I got into the movie side of things, and I wrote some scripts, and that was exciting. But it wasn't fulfilling. I'm kind of a type A guy, and sitting in the room playing with my imaginary friends in my early 40s, just got to be unfulfilling. So, and I was a very good safety engineer. So I wanted to find, I was done with firefighting. That's a young man's game. I didn't want to be a factory type safety guy anymore, like I was, because those are stupid long hours. And, if I didn't have to investigate another fatality or something, that would be fine too. And I stumbled into this job with a trade association where it's a director of safety job. But for the association. So my job was for the scrap recycling industry. So my job was trying to increase the overall safety awareness of our members who kill people or at an alarming rate at that time. And so it was a job of public speaking and writing articles and, kind of doing pep rallies. And there was some teaching in it too. There's a 40-hour training course and that sort of thing, which honestly, I think I could still do in my sleep. I've done it so many hundreds of times. And it was fun. It was good. It was multimedia, and everybody had a good time. And like I said, I thought I was good at it. And I was still writing in my spare time, and I was as prolific as a part-time writer as I was as a full-time writer. Sure. So, and then I realized I got tired of the association business. Associations are about, and casting no aspersions if anybody's watching this. Associations are about sucking up to their members and influencing politics, and that's fine. That's not what I was doing. I was trying to improve the safety record of an industry. And it seems like they can coexist, but after about 10 and a half years, I realized that there was a complete mismatch. And, and it was me, I evolved into, or the organization evolves and the individual evolves. And we had just evolved apart from each other. And so I quit and went back to full-time writing. That was 10 years ago.
Well, yeah, it's funny. I think it's relationships can be that way, right? And business and the employee has a relationship just like, a man and wife or whoever, right? Any relationships you have, sometimes you just evolve a little differently. I guess my day gig, I'm part-time now, but I was a director of quality regulatory for a medical device company. So I worked with our safety guys all the time because it was a lot of manufacturing and things, things of that nature. And you could see it on certain people. And I would even, I'm just very open generally. So open at work as well. And I'd be like, look, maybe you're just you're at a place where maybe it's time to find another place. I'm not firing you, but maybe you've kind of hit the point where the company is diverged off and the company sell. And, that's why
you can tell in yourself and you can tell in yourself and in others when they're not having fun anymore. And it affects and infects everything that they do. And that is when it's time to move on.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder, was there anything with just the loss of kind of having a pack around you? Because, writing's so solitary, generally, unless you go into movies, you have a writer's room or something. But versus, because I know when they closed, our company's bought and sold, and end up closing my the factory I worked at, and they kept me on part-time to help with projects and special initiatives, things like that. And so I've been working from home prior to COVID, it's been years, but there was a real hard point for me was the loss of having people around me. And I can be very solitary generally, but then there was the suddenly not having it, where I was like, oh, I feel a little unbuoyed and a little lost in the woods here. Was that related to it at all, or?
Oh, I think so. Absolutely. Like I said, I am the classic extrovert that I draw energy. I become energized when I'm around other people. And, and by creativity, by professional the technical creativity was often driven by the presence of other people who are really smart in what they're doing. And then you kind of banter back and forth about, well, what would happen if such and such and so and so. Yeah. And the water cooler. Well, to me, water cooler is about gossip. And of course, that's important too. But just in terms of achieving goals, it's the stuff that happens when you're walking past somebody's door and you go, oh, and you come back and say, you got a minute? And you talk. I missed all of that, actually. And I think that's what drove me to go back to work as much as anything else. When I project out to having been in that job and then endured the COVID shutdowns where everything goes virtual, and we spend, my former colleagues, distant colleagues, it's been years since I had been there. They talk about, this kind of meeting, Zoom meetings that go on for 8 and 10 hours a day. I'd shoot myself. This is fine, right? But to actually be engaged in your house, and in my case, it's less. I don't have any little kids around here, and I got a nice office, But for the folks who are living in an apartment building, and you're sharing the apartment with a bunch of other people, that would be just impossible.
Right. Oh yeah. Now, I remember my granddaughter was staying with us for a while, and I'd be on Zoom meetings, and she would just be going wild behind me. You're trying to figure things out. So I get it completely. How do you fulfill that now that you've been out of it? How do you fulfill that kind of extrovert needs?
I have a new house and a new puppy.
Ah, you got the puppy.
Yeah, so that helps.
It's funny that when you mentioned the puppy, it reminded me is so we're blended. So I had 2 daughters. My wife had a daughter, and then we had our son. So there's the old show like mine, hers, ours, or something.
Yours,
that's very
mine,
much
and ours.
Yours, mine, and ours. Okay, thank you. So no one ever corrected me. I've gotten that wrong.
Lucille
for 2
Ball
years
and
of
Henry
shows.
Fonda.
Right. And so when the older daughters, my 2 firstborn, were getting out of the house, I wanted to get a dog, and we already had one little dog, and suddenly I want to get a dog. And not only do I get one dog, I get 2 dogs. And I don't even know why. I have 2 chocolate labs. So at some point they'll probably start howling and going nuts, next to me here. because that's their role in the show, is to cause chaos. And my wife was like, you're just replacing your daughters like with two other things you need to care for. And I was like, oh, no, I guess you're right. But here they are, so I get the puppy completely. So then before we transition to the writing talk, I did want to mention, and it's writing adjacent, well, not even adjacent, it's writing related, but I know most of what you write is fiction. You wrote the nonfiction book, 6 Minutes to Freedom. And so I did have a few questions maybe about that situation and how that all came to be. Maybe then for the audience, you can just give kind of the brief setup, to the book.
To 6 Men?
Yeah.
Okay. 6 Minutes was actually the 6 Minutes to Freedom is the name of the book. That was, I think it was my fifth book that I wrote. And I had run into, right, when you write books, everybody's got an idea for you, right? So you end up, I know this guy. This is the thing you need to write about. So it kind of developed this reflex of, thank you, but try you be polite, but thank you, no.
Sure.
And this was a dear friend of mine, Pat Barney, had been to he was a Rotarian. He'd been to a meeting and he heard this guy, Kurt Muse, that told this story of how Kurt, and a bunch of his fellow Rotarians essentially brought down Manuel Noriega in 1989. Didn't quite bring him down, but certainly did him a lot of damage, and got themselves named persona non grata, or public enemy number one, in Panama. And then Kurt was arrested, and his family had to flee. His daughter, actually his 15-year-old daughter and 12-year-old son, had to flee Panama, the country, by themselves, while the Panamanian Defense Forces were trying to get them and arrest them. And Kurt was put in prison and then ultimately rescued by Delta Force in the opening shots of Operation Just Cause. I thought, well, wow, that's quite a story. And
sure.
And at first I didn't believe it, and because why hadn't I heard that story before? It's a pretty pat story. I did some research and I ended up reached out to Kurt, and he talked to me on the phone. And then the two families, he had, and Annie, his wife, and Joy, my wife, we got to went to dinner together. As a very genuine, honest guy, and the story had never been told because he never found a writer that he thought would tell it the right way. Everybody wants to tell the third act. The rescue. Operation Acid Gambit was the name of his rescue mission, and that's well documented. You can find that everywhere. But what you can't find is the background about the family and the impact on his extended family of his was perceived certainly by Noriega as treason. And while he ultimately saved a lot of lives by what he did, but his extended family, his parents owned a company there, and so did his brother and sister, and all these people all work for the company. And because Kurt got arrested for what he was doing, they all had to flee too. So there's this trickle down effect that was pretty devastating on the family, not so much financially as it was emotionally. And yet people worked diligently behind the scenes to effect his rescue, or at least to keep him safe while he was in prison. So his daughter, Kimberly, who, when I guess by then she was 16, wrote a letter to President Bush, 41, H.W. Bush. And, my father, it's exactly what you'd expect a teenage daughter who adores her father to write. My father's a hero. He's doing, all that sort of thing. It's a beautiful letter. It's a very articulate, wonderful letter. But then she also sent a copy to Barbara Bush with I know your husband's a busy man and he might not find this. So if you could send, that's the letter that actually went to the president. Yeah. And after that, the Kurt's situation became part of the presidential daily briefing. And they started to plan his rescue as they ramped up for Operation Just Cause. They realized that very clearly, actually, there was a guard outside Kurt's door whose job it was to shoot Kurt if anything went bad. So if the opening shots of the invasion had to be to rescue Kurt from this prison fortress. So,
right.
so the book goes into all of that. It's called 6 Minutes to Freedom. And it was just such an honor to meet all of these people and
Sure.
to be included in that inner sanctum, and to spend an hour and a half with President Bush was kind of cool too.
Sure.
So it was, and it changed everything. That book and the research that came from it and the contacts I made through Kurt, as a result of all this, that's where the entire Jonathan Graves series comes from. It's leveraged off of the research for that book.
Sure. What did it teach you about the military, just folks in general?
Well, for the special forces folks, the special operators,
sure,
they are first and foremost patriots. The things that they sacrifice, the things they do routinely that we don't know anything about. I'm going to be deliberately provocative here because I've made promises I can't break. But after the book came out, we went to the Delta Force compound at Fort Bragg, like onto the compound. Like, really, one does not drive one's own car. And so
sure.
we get driven in, and there's, I don't know, dozens of people. We were supposed to be meeting the command sergeant major for Delta and then an SAS equivalent. It turned out to be this library full of people, and they all had books they wanted to sign. They wanted to hear the story and all this. And the command sergeant major said, "Would you like a tour?" to me. And I said, "Yeah." And the Miss Marion she was Charlie Beckwith's secretary when Delta first started, and it was her 80th birthday while we were there. And she was apoplectic that you cannot give these people a tour. They haven't, but he did it anyway. And they have these, I don't know, dioramas where you get mannequins and you dress them up and to play out the scenes. And this is history changing stuff, and history making stuff. Really? That was you guys? Yeah, well, yeah. And so the stuff that they do and the risks that they take, it ain't for the pay. And they're truly, truly patriots. The guy named James Sutterth, who tragically passed away from a heart attack when he was 49 years old watching a football game.
Jeez.
And but he was the one who was very intimately involved, like hands-on involved with Kurt's rescue, like grabbing his lapels and taking him out. And we were trying to get them to talk to us. We had Kurt's story, we had his family story, but there's this big hole about, that is the third act, and nobody would talk to us. And he never came close to sharing secrets, but he was horribly wounded in the rescue. And when he was talking about lying in an armored personnel carrier and wounded, looking up through the hatch, and he saw people waving American flags. And when he mentioned the American flag, he teared up and he couldn't continue. It's an amazing slice of people. When I was visiting President Bush, his thing was, and he teared up. Well, he's a famous crier anyway, but he teared up, and because he visited them, after the fact in the hospitals and such. And he said, "I don't know where we find these men, because they're that special." So, and the interesting story there too, because nobody would tell us the story. And I met with Brent Scowcroft, General Scowcroft, who was the National Security Advisor under 41, bought him coffee at some hotel in DC. He didn't even drink the coffee. And he was just very circumspect. And sure. And he would ask a few questions, and Kurt was with me, and we kind of pitched the story of what we were trying to do. I think everybody was so tired of the negative depiction of the American military, and they didn't want to be a part of that. But after we met with General Scowcroft, I got a call in my office from I don't know, call her Julie. I have no idea what her real name was. Is this Mr. Gilstrap? Yes. Well, this is Julie. I'm President Bush's secretary. The president would like to meet with you in his office in Houston next Wednesday. Can you be there? Well, I have a dental appointment. Can we do it Thursday? So, the answer is yes, we can do that. Right. And we flew down and we met with President Bush. Got nothing out of the meeting other than fanboy service, and told the story and got got on his Christmas card list, which is nice. But we didn't really get anything out of it until a week later, maybe 2 weeks later, we hear from General Boykin, Jerry Boykin, who was the colonel who was in charge of that part of Delta Force in 1989 when this went down. And he said, I don't know what you did, but the boys can talk to you. Ask them anything you want to know. So
very cool.
So we got the story.
Very cool. That's amazing. Did you ever, just with your background and things, did you ever consider going into the military, or was that anything that?
No, I remember I graduated in 1979. So we were just coming off of the bruising Vietnam era. It's a regret of mine that I did not. But I always did. You brought it up. I always had this my dad was career military, and there's a sense of service over self. And I looked at doing Peace Corps, but also be true to thyself. There's no way I can poop in a ditch. It's just not, it's not my thing when that's a good day. So that's part of why I got into the fire and rescue service. I think, it's to give back, to take one for your community. So I sort of scratched the itch through that. But if I were to go back again, if I were graduating, it's hard to judge, right? Because you take today's life experience and you project it onto a much younger me. I think going into the military is a spectacular thing to do. Between you live really intensely in dangerous times, and the fact that for that slice in time, those young men and women, especially the younger ones, once you advance up and you get to the command ranks, that's a career, but for the grunts, these are folks that are dedicating their lives to something that is much bigger than they are, and they do it willingly and happily. And it's terrible when some of them come back mangled or die. And the country should mourn much more than we do when that happens. But for the individuals who come through it, they're fundamentally changed, and for the most part changed for the good, because you realize no matter all that cool stuff you thought you were when you were in high school, in reality, there are people who really need your help and are much more important at that moment than you are.
Right. No, that's a lovely way to say it. Thanks for sharing that. So maybe that then would be a perfect moment to transition. I always joke on the show that with a name called Writers Drinking Whiskey, I'm ethically mandated to speak about writing a little bit, so maybe then we can transition over to that a bit. I wonder then, because you mentioned that's the inspiration for the Jonathan Graves character and series coming from there. Was it intentional to kind of launch into a series? Was it one novel, then you kind of love the character? How did that kind of come about?
With the Graves series, yes, it was intentional, because I knew that it's kind of, I don't know how far into the weeds you want to go on this, but there's a fundamental difference where Delta, and to a lesser extent Navy SEALs, are at way in the past were dedicated to hostage rescue. That was kind of their thing. And the mission of a hostage rescue, an 0300 mission, is to rescue the hostage. Everything else is secondary. The hostage is coming home. Now, while you're there, if you gather some intel and all that, that's fine. But the mission is a failure if the hostage doesn't come home. Domestically, and that's only done overseas, that we don't have military operations on U.S. Territory. Domestically, when people are kidnapped and there are SWAT teams and the FBI hostage rescue team and all of that, obviously we want to get the hostage back, but it's viewed, and this comes from one of the HRT members, a very good friend of mine. He said, let's be honest, John, a hostage taking is a homicide in slow motion. The anticipation of getting the hostage back alive, yes, they're going to work very hard to do it. But the anticipation is, got an 80% chance of winning on this one. The mission is not a failure if the hostage dies. the mission is a failure if the bad guy gets away. So think about the fundamental difference there. We will, domestically, we have this constitution, right? And people have, even the bad guys have their rights. So you have to get a warrant to listen, to search, to do all of those things have to be in a row before you pull the trigger on the hostage rescue. But the primary mission is to make sure the bad guys don't go away. Overseas, with the special forces operation, there are no warrants. There are no lawyers. Well, I guess there are, but it's at the senior executive level. So the mission is you go in, bang, bang, and you get the bad guy out. So I thought that was a really interesting difference. So what Jonathan Grave, my character, is a freelance hostage rescue specialist, and he takes the foreign model and applies it here. So if your loved one is taken, Jonathan will bring him back. I write thrillers, so it often does not go well for the bad guys. But in the eyes of the law, he's a murderer. He leaves, there are no warrants. He has no permission to break down that door. He has no permission to listen to the phone lines that he breaks into and all of that through his staff. So, he's on the wrong side of the law, but on the right side of the angels is the way he thinks of himself. Sure.
It's kind of the vigilante justice to some.
Well, to some kind degree. But I see vigilantes as different. He's not out to hurt people. If the bad guys surrender, they're good. He doesn't even arrest them. He can't arrest them. He's not a law enforcement officer.
Right.
But it wouldn't be much of a thriller if the bad guys didn't fight back.
Well, the Grave showed up. You go do what you need
doing
to
happy
do.
things happily. It's just not a good thriller.
Sticking with the series for a minute, there's also the Victoria Emerson thrillers, right? Which is also a series. And that's the post-apocalyptic kind of, there's a global apocalypse and it comes. Was there a reason you wanted to delve into that post-apocalyptic kind of realm?
Yes. And let me be clear. We had this discussion with my publisher. Post-apocalyptic now means zombies and or something supernatural. That's not this. This is bad thing. The apocalypse happens, nuclear war happens, and it's about surviving after the fact. And I can tell you exactly, this is one of the few stories that actually arrived in my head fully formed, like almost startled me. My wife and I were visiting the Greenbrier, which is this gorgeous resort in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, down along the Virginia border, Virginia, Tennessee, down in the corner. And it was the U.S. government relocation center for Congress back in the day. And the Washington Post decided it didn't need to be secret anymore, and they leaked the story in 1994. And so now it's open to the public. But the idea was that in the event that a war was coming, that the House and the Senate would be evacuated to the Greenbrier, which had these huge bunkers. They were all built in secret. Blast doors were hidden by wallpaper. It's really that whole thing is fascinating. If you get a chance to go to the Greenbrier there, it's well worth going to the place to take the tour. At least I thought so. So as we're going through this tour, there was one detail that stuck out to me. You've got 535 members of Congress, 435 in the House, 100 in the Senate. Each of them can bring one staff member. So now you got roughly 1,100 people that have to be fed 3 times a day, and you got to have flushing toilets, and you got to have all this kind of stuff. They were not allowed to bring family. Wow. So here you are, a member of the House, and in this case, Victoria lost her husband in combat, so she's a single mom, and she shows up, and they say you can't bring your kids in. She quits on the spot to survive. And so the war does come. I won't go into the details of how that happens. But so Victoria is in the mountains of West Virginia, and she's kind of a survivalist. She's a prepper, and as her boys. And she's got a security detail that took her to the bunker, and now they're stuck because they thought they were going to be in the bunker, but now they're not anymore. And it's really about surviving, which is kind of a topic I'm interested in. But more than that, it's about rebuilding. When you look at the average so-called prepper, which is, I frankly think people should do more of that. But in the cliche, the idea is I've got mine and I'm going to survive. Yeah, but there's absence of imagination there, because sooner or later you're going to have to meet up with other people. And how's that going to happen? And in this case, while billions of people died in my fictional war, billions of people survived. They just don't know where each other are because there's no communication. So Victoria is just that person. I don't know if you've known these in your life or not. There are people who are natural leaders, and you know they're natural leaders because people naturally follow them. It's that simple. And so that's who Victoria is. And she doesn't want to be this. She has no desire to tell other people what to do, but she kind of falls into that situation. And she ends up becoming part of a community called Ortho in West Virginia. It's a totally fictional town. And so it's about the rebuilding of, after the fact, and dealing with the feral crowds. People are not necessarily, if you take everything away from somebody, they become feral very quickly, I think. We were shooting people over toilet paper during COVID, right? And people were hoarding hand sanitizer at a time that we thought that's what saved lives, at a time that we thought without hand sanitizer, people would die. And the instinct was to take all of it so that I can have all this, and screw you, you don't need any of it. So, and that's just over an imagined threat, as it turned out to be. We didn't know at the time, but as an imagined threat, imagine it's an existential threat. And it's the last of the heart medicine, or the last of the baby formula, or the last of the diapers. What are people willing to do? And I just wanted to explore that. And what I ended up with, and it's a trilogy, it's not really a series. There's Crimson Phoenix, then Blue Fire, and then White Smoke. And the way it ended up, I think, it explores uncomfortable territory, but ultimately it's pretty hopeful, because ultimately I have a lot of faith in people to be people. I think, I also think there are some bad folks that need to be dealt with too. But I'm very proud of that series, but it's, again, just a 3 and out.
Moving to the craft portion of it a bit, with the thrillers, is there instilling dread, right? You need some kind of dread that's kind of propelling things forward one way or the other. What, just from a writing, and you can feel free to be as esoteric as you want, so it's kind of for the writers and the crowd.
Let me get my padded elbows for the the leather.
All right, but what are the techniques? What are the devices and such you use to try to infuse that into your writing?
To bring in
dread, a sense of foreboding, or the tension, I guess, maybe we could even just more generally. Well,
some of it, I mean, there are a number of different ways. The cheapest one is at a chapter break, to say he couldn't believe what happened next, right? And then and then move on. That's actually pretty easy. I won't say that I haven't done it. Of course I have. Sure. Then there's another way to do it is just through the sense of feeling but not knowing. It just, we all of us approach the unknown in a different way. It's the difference between walking into your house and, you've been out, it's at night, walk into your house and it's exactly as you remember it being, is different than walking into your house and you see there's a light on that you don't remember leaving on. Sure. So that's not a jump out at you kind of scare, but it's a detail that builds the tension and builds the sense of what's going to happen. And then there's just the anticipation. I write thrillers again, so you've got one party. The two parties are like trains that are heading toward each other, where the reader knows that the collision is coming, but the character does not. And so there's that sense of get out of the way, do that, do the thing that I want you to do, but you can't possibly know you have to do because you don't have that data set. So there are all kinds of ways to go about doing it, but it's very deliberate.
Sure. Yeah, I believe it.
I've always thought of a book as an engineered product.
Right. No, I think that's a good way to think of it. Is there any common misconceptions about thrillers? Anything you would debunk?
I think that they take, well, it depends on the crowd, right? So if I'm in front of a bunch, if I'm at an event, if I'm speaking to a Master of Fine Arts class, there's this sense that I should apologize because I'm only writing commercial fiction that sells real well. I'm not doing right. I'm not doing literary fiction that nobody's ever going to read. I think that modern fiction, good commercial fiction, and I mean like Michael Connelly and Jeffrey Deaver, and there's a lot of depth of characters, depth of plotting, really good writing, and I don't think that the genre writers get the credit that they deserve. I mean, if there was ever a book award, National Book Award, that went to John Grisham, I think the world would explode, right? Because no. Sure. So I think the big misconception is that genre fiction in general, not just thrillers, are not well written, and I think that's wrong. And even the notion of what's well written and what's not. A romance, the classic romance, the bodice ripper, it's not my kind of story, but that doesn't mean it's not well written. And they sell gojillions. It's the number one genre in the world is romance. So, I think that the judgment call, the misconception that genre writing in general, mystery thriller in particular, isn't serious fiction. I don't even know what that means, but I've heard these things mentioned. In fact, I taught. There's a high school in Fairfax County, Virginia, that they had their annual literary conference, which I think is wonderful for the kids. They write stuff, and I would come in, not just me, but there are other local writers who come in and kind of help to workshop some of the manuscripts that they'd done. It was, take a day out of your life, and it was usually worthwhile. There was this one class that I was teaching where they had submitted, I get the stuff, it's like 5 pages, and I get it a week ahead of time, and I mark it up, and I always let the kids go first. And there was this one in particular where everybody was showing great deference to this young lady, and who later I found out was the editor of the literary magazine. So you suck up to the editor. They're learning that lesson really early, and it's an important lesson to learn. But I had some comments on what she had written, and this 18-year-old, 17, whatever she was, looked at me and said, "No offense, Mr. Gilstrap, but you write commercial crap. I don't think you can understand what I've written here." I said, "I can understand that it's time for you to leave the room." and she got all puffy, and I just sat quietly. I said, "No, really, it's time for you to leave the room." Right. And which she did. She's really good on the door slam too, just so you know. That was very good. Very good. I mean, as someone that's gone through 3 teenage daughters, I can appreciate that. The look, the eye roll, that right. But you don't understand because everything I do is perfect, and I don't know why you would not understand that. And then so I know you wrote some scripts for a while. Were you part of the was it SAG-AFTRA, the Hollywood, quote unquote Hollywood writer's strike, or were you involved in that at all? Or well, I'm not the latest one. I was part. Okay. Well, I was part of the 1999, 2000, somewhere in that sleeve of time. No, actually, it was the early 2000s. I was part of it because I was part of the union, and they went on strike. I thought then, and I was proved to be right, that the strikes hurt the rank and file members of these unions. What happens is it culls the herd, makes sure that the stars, whether it's stars on the screen or stars on the page or stars in the production room or wherever it is, it makes sure that they have less competition. Because what happens is we get fewer and fewer projects to assign, and those projects go to the folks who don't have the other big work to do. And it's the new guys, which in my case, where I was in that strike, I just had a couple of scripts out. And then those, and I was not on the, $300 million projects, right? I'm on the $80,000, $90,000, the little guys.
Sure.
And so they just dried up and my career went away, but the big guys continued to prosper. So yes, I was a part of the strike. I was not happy about being part of the strike. And the bizarre part of it was they called me and asked me, I was living in Virginia, and they asked me if I was, when I was going to walk on the picket line. I said, what picket line? We don't have a picket line. I'm in Fairfax County, Virginia. Right. I said, well, you can go and you can picket your local theater. I said, you mean just stand outside the theater with a sign? Yeah, well, I'm not doing that. So,
yeah.
That's who would do that? Just in Virginia, no less. You get hit with tomatoes and stuff. Yourself, it's a right to work state. So I kind of got sideways with the union, and you get kicked out if you haven't you haven't been paid for a project in X number of years. I don't know what it is. I think it's 9 or 10 years. If you haven't been paid in that amount of time, then you're no longer part of the union. So, and I aged out, as it were.
Let's then get to our shots portion. You don't have to do shots, is always optional, but so rapid fire questions. You ready to roll?
I'm ready.
All right. True or false? Whenever you enter West Virginia, the radio automatically tunes to John Denver.
Yeah, that would be false. It should, but it's false.
So it's just something I do. There you go. Favorite podcast, and why is it Writers Drinking Whiskey?
Well, it's actually Writers Drinking Whiskey, obviously. I mean, is there anything else that it's self-evident? There are some we need air to breathe. We need this podcast to live.
Yeah, the waters of life. You mentioned being Irish before, right? That's the Irish term for whiskey. So very good. This will definitely be on the promo reel now. So. Have you ever witnessed anything inexplicable?
Yes.
Yeah.
You want me to go from there?
I would love to go from there. Yeah.
All right. I actually had which one am I going to do here? Okay. I had spine surgery, and I was recovering I had spinal fusion in my neck. And I don't know, we can blame this on the medication, or we can blame it on woo-woo. But my mom passed away when I was 32 years old. And I was at home and I was recovering, and I was, have you ever done narcotics for the pain relief? For me, I get all loopy, right? It's almost a near sleep. And I woke up to this white figure who patted my cheek and looked at, not a face per se, but a very definitive outline. And she faded off and kind of misted away. And so, it was touching at the time. It was very moving at the time. I don't know if it was real. I choose to believe it's real, and therefore it's not explainable.
Very good. I believe it. I always ask that question because if I ever started a second show, it would probably be about all things, unexplained and things. So thank you for sharing that. Worst piece of advice you've ever received?
Wow. Hold my beer. Worst piece of advice. Got it. 8th grade. Go ahead and take him on. Bullies are all talk. No one told Richard Goldsberry that bullies were all talk. But I will tell you that Richard Goldsberry has died in at least, by name, not by description, in at least 10 of my books. There will be a dead body named Richard Goldsberry.
Very good. Okay, so what did explosive safety teach you about relationships, and how can I apply that to my relationship with my teenage daughters?
What did it teach me about relationships? Okay, I'm going to take a larger stand on relationships. When explosives are burning, and you're in the fire department, never get closer to the fire than the guy in charge of the safety department. Right? That's you keep an eye on me, and trust me, I'm as close as anybody wants to be. Right, how does that affect your daughters? I've never had daughters, but it would involve, in my mind, it involves dates and cleaning guns somehow. So
there was an old country song that I used to play. I told all the daughters, it's where the dad the boy shows up to get him, and the dad's just cleaning his gun. He's like, "Oh, you guys have a good time. I'll be here all night cleaning this gun."
Exactly.
So that's great advice. How do we get rid of the hazardous waste in our lives?
Okay, are we talking metaphorical hazardous waste, or are we talking about the crap we got in the garage that we're really worried about?
Whichever one you want, wherever you want to take it.
Well, I can't speak for California, because California is just a little nutball of crazy regulation. But I can tell you, most of the country, the stuff that's in your garage, if you're not running a business, you can pretty much do anything you want with it. You're not regulated. The businesses around, you can be a bad person, but it's usually not regulated. As far as the other hazardous waste in your lives, get rid of it, flush it. You don't, the metaphorical stuff. If there's a toxic relationship, walk away from the toxic relationship. I've been kind of blessed that way. I met my wife on a blind date. We've been married over 40 years. Some of it can be negotiated away. Some realize that it's entirely possible that of the two of you, you're the asshole, not the other party.
Sure.
So, but if it's really anything that's toxic in your life, whether it be chemically or relationship wise, life's too short. You only got this many days.
Sure. Well, I think that's a good way to think of it too. Sometimes you're the toxic one, and if you can't get rid of the toxic waste if it's in you without first acknowledging it's there. So,
right.
Fair enough. So, and last one for the shots section here. So my dad is an engineer, aerospace engineer, now retired. Is the reason he looks at me funny when I share my dreams because you should never share your dreams with engineers? Or should I just start sharing my dreams in my dream journal?
Well, a lot has to do with what you're dreaming about, dude. So there are some dreams that just no dad wants to hear. So that could be the reason he's looking at you that way. That's entirely inappropriate. Even while you're sleeping, you should not be thinking those things. If you want to put them in the dream journal, we call that discovery and documentation. So, it's all up to you.
I'm on my own.
It's called a manifesto if you really go too far.
Right. Good to know. Good advice. Thank you for that. And so thank you so much for that. So I know you had something you were going to read for us today. So you want to, is that going to be from the latest book, or?
It's going to be from Harm's Way, which is the latest book to come out, not the one I just finished that comes out next summer.
Okay.
All right.
Beautiful.
Here we go. Chapter 2. Jonathan Grave always thought that the Cathedral of St. Matthew the Apostle on Rhode Island Avenue in Washington, D.C. tipped more toward ugly than pretty. It didn't even look like a cathedral. Its red earthen tones and rounded shapes printed more as a museum than a place of worship. As he approached from the west, he remembered how much he hated coming downtown. He wasn't a city guy, never had been. Now that the crime rate was skyrocketing and businesses were fleeing, what little charm the place once had dwindled to third world levels in places. The only time he drove into town at all was to attend the annual gala he threw at the Kennedy Center for Resurrection House, the residential school that Jonathan had established for the children of incarcerated parents, or to attend the meeting like the one that lay ahead for him in a few minutes with Irene Rivers, the director of the FBI. A couple of presidential administrations ago, Director Rivers, aka Wolverine in Jonathan's shop, had converted Our Lady Chapel just inside St. Matthew's grand doors to one of the most secure meeting places on the planet. The cathedral had been undergoing a renovation at the time, and Wolverine had pumped a couple $1 million of her discretionary fund into the acoustic modifications that deadened sound and rendered electronic eavesdropping equipment useless. The meeting was scheduled for 10, and as Jonathan entered at 3 minutes after, he knew that she'd be pissed. As he passed from daylight to the darkness of the interior, Jonathan turned to the right and walked toward the two nutcracker impersonators who doubled as the director's security detail. The stone-faced agents closed ranks in a kind of pincer movement. The one on the right said, "Sir, you can't come this way." "Down, boy. Jonathan said. I'm here to see your master. Jonathan didn't have a lot of time for feds in general, and except for Wolverine, had a particular problem with the FBI. Too much ego and bombast from bureaucrats who carried pistols as belt decorations. The security toad puffed up. Look, asshole. Let him through, Agent Malone. Jonathan would recognize that voice anywhere. So would much of the world. Irene was not only the director and not only a woman, but she'd also started a career as a field agent. And even though television cameras were not friendly to her, Jonathan found her very attractive in person. They'd worked together for a very long time. Agent Malone clearly was not pleased by his order, but he made room for Jonathan to pass. You need to thank her later, Jonathan said. She just saved you from weeks of recovery time. Malone puffed up again, and Jonathan smiled. He entered Our Lady Chapel and found Irene Rivers standing at the threshold, hands at her waist, that look marring her features. Jonathan offered his hand. You've got your mad face on, he said. Why must you pick fights with my detail all the time? She asked. There was a smirk behind the scowl as she shook his hand with both of hers. Because it's easy and earned, Jonathan said. Do you think they practice their badass faces in the mirror every morning? Come have a seat and behave yourself, Irene said. She led him toward the chapel, into the front of the little chapel, closer to the altar than they usually sat. Jonathan sensed the approach of bad news, and he straightened up his act. As he helped himself to one of the plain wooden chairs, Irene turned her seat so that they could look at each other from a much closer distance than usual. In the decades that they had known each other, Irene had not changed much. If the strawberry blonde hair came out of a bottle, John wouldn't have known anyway, but her eyes remained as hard and sharp as ever, and he'd always thought she had beautiful skin. Jonathan kept his mouth shut and let her get to her point in her own time. I trust you've heard about the missionary kidnappings in Venezuela, she said. Yeah. Jonathan drew out the word to be 2 seconds long. Saying it that way makes me think you know what I'm going to ask you to do, Irene said. I'll let you tell me anyway. Irene folded her arms and crossed her legs. It was her tell for bad waters churning ahead. If you've been listening to the news, you know that the bad guys snatched 10 Baptist missionaries off a farm in northeast Venezuela, and now they're holding them for ransom. Jonathan stopped watching the news and reading American newspapers ages ago, back when they stopped reporting and started banging drums for the politicians of their choice. But yes, he had heard of the kidnappings. The ransom part is odd, Jonathan said. Are they all wealthy? The ransoms vary depending on the individual hostage, Irene explained. The terrorists did their research. The amounts are all painful, but still doable if the families reach out to their financial networks. What about the church itself? Irene waved that away. You're too Catholic, she said. I wager God would disagree, Jonathan said. I know Father D'Angelo would. Tom D'Angelo was a pastor of St. Catherine's Catholic Church in Jonathan's hometown of Fisherman's Cove, Virginia. He was also the friend Jonathan had known longest since their days as freshman year roommates at the College of William and Mary in Virginia. Be that as it may, Baptists don't have a central church, or so I'm told. What happens if they don't come up with a ransom? I'm afraid that detail is not in the marketing packet, Irene said. I haven't heard anything about an or else. Who are the bad guys? Jonathan asked. We don't know. Something cartel related is always a good guess, but we're not sure. You're the FBI, Jonathan said. How can you not know? Thank you for the reminder. You may recall from older news that the Darman administration is very keen on building great relations with countries south of the border. I didn't think we had a border anymore, Jonathan said. Well, exactly. So keen is the president on these relationships, so we've been forced to pull most of our intel assets out, and the State Department is under orders not to cooperate with us. Does Darman have a thing against Baptists? Jonathan asked. Darman has trouble forming words. His motivation is not my concern. Shouldn't it be? Jonathan asked. Competence notwithstanding, he is the President of the United States. Isn't this his call? Of course it's his call, which is why I can't ask you to do what I'm about to ask you to do. Rescue the missionaries? Exactly. Why? I mean, not to be hard-hearted, I imagine there are hostages taken all over the world. Not all of them are Baptists, but neither am I. Irene inhaled deeply and crossed her legs the other way. I'm afraid this one's more personal, she said. Jonathan scowled. He was the last guy to back away from a fight, but this didn't feel right. Every act of violence is personal to someone, Wolfie. You're not telling me something. One of the hostages in particular is very important to me, she said. To you, Irene Rivers, or to you, the director of the FBI? More the latter than the former, Irene said. I have the discretionary funds to pay you for your efforts. Oh, I know you'll pay me for my efforts, Jonathan said with a scoff, but that assumes I'll say yes. You need to give me more information if you want me to invade a sovereign nation and wreak havoc without official sanction. It doesn't have to be havoc, she said. Jonathan gave her a look. Ops like this always wrought havoc. Look, he said, you've got your HRT, hostage rescue team. If you're not asking them, yet asking me, there's a twist you're not sharing. Come on, give it up. He's a confidential informant, Irene said. He's from the DC area and he's been helping us with a very sensitive matter. We need to keep him happy. You're not answering my question, Jonathan pressed. Why not the HRT? She looked at him. Jonathan had known her long enough to read where her head was taking her. She knew she could trust Jonathan to take any and every secret to the grave with him, and they'd done enough off-the-record transactions like this that he could rest assured that she would protect his secrets. Still, she was hesitant to give him more details. This part's not negotiable, Wolfie. I don't need the money, but of course I'll take it. What I really don't need is to put myself and my team in mortal danger without a good reason. Irene closed her eyes, sighed, and gave herself up to the inevitable. As you know, my team has been less than reliable keeper of secrets. I've had to choose my inner circle very carefully and by hand. The HRT is elite, and they know it. They are all careerists whose eyes are focused on the backside of the political appointee closest to them. The proverbial light bulb came on over Jonathan's head. So your informant has dirt on a political appointee. He doesn't quite have it yet, Irene said, but he's working on it. What kind of dirt are we talking about? Oh, come on, Digger. Jonathan waited for it. Irene wasn't holding the strong hand after all. She growled a little as she sighed, and she lowered her voice even more. It's the kind of dirt that tells our enemies secrets they don't need to hear. Are we talking about naming spies, or is this political window keeping again? This is the real deal, and it comes from a very high level. How high? Irene waved off the question. I've answered your question as well as I'm going to, but high enough to be asking you to help. Something about this still was not adding up for Jonathan. Why don't you just pay the ransom for your guy out of your slush fund and save the bucks you'll be paying to me and my team? The trail is too risky. With you, if some guy with an eye shade decides to follow the money, which there's really no way to, the path leads to lead-lined brick wall. With kidnappers, any kind of trail gives them too much leverage against me, and the slush fund, as you so harshly put it, she used finger quotes. Jonathan supposed that made sense in the unsettling, spooky kind of way that all transactions with Wolverine did. Do we get to use our badges and fake creds? He asked. Not too long ago, when Irene had milked him for a different favor, she'd issued ersatz credentials to his team, complete with fake work histories and personal biographies. Absolutely not, she said. This is 100% OTR. It's not like we can fly commercial, Jonathan said. We're going to need a few of your assets and some kind of cover just to not get shot down on final approach. I can give you cover to land your plane, Irene said, but I'm telling you that all of our clandestine sites have been shut down. How long ago? Within the last year, I guess. That's more the agency's domain than mine. I need you to find out if the runways are still there. You don't understand, Scorpion, Irene objected. I can't do that. Then I won't rescue your missionaries. She looked stunned. Jonathan held up his hands and shrugged. I stopped saluting to suicide missions a long time ago, he said. I'll take this on, but you've got to have some skin in the game. You've got to get us some intel and some infrastructure. I don't mind not carrying FBI creds, and I don't mind planning the op, but when I say I need you, I expect you to be there. Now Irene looked hurt. Have I ever left you twisting in the wind? No, you have not, Jonathan admitted. But I've got to tell you something about this doesn't feel right. We've worked together for a long time, so if you tell me you're being fully forthcoming, then I'll believe you. But Venezuela isn't Mexico, and it isn't Colombia. These guys can be sophisticated, and I only go places where the odds are stacked wildly in my favor. You need to help me out. Truly, this was not a negotiable point. Okay, Irene said softly, I can pull some strings to get you in. I'll send you the info on your precious cargo when, wait, Jonathan said. Irene's ears turned red. She hated being interrupted. I'm not going in for just your guy. I'm going for all of them or none of them. I want intel on every hostage. Are you out of your mind? Irene said, a whispered shout. Rescuing 10 people is 1,000 times more difficulty than rescuing just one. It really isn't, Jonathan said. It's a lesson I've learned the hard way. I'll grant your guy status as PC1 as our primary precious cargo, but lives are lives, Wolfie. Plus, every hostage you don't rescue becomes another enemy in the land of enemies. Your guy's life isn't any more valuable than the others just because he's got details on his head that you want to hear. Why the hell would you let him go to there in the first place if his brain is so important? Irene broke eye contact. Being there is an important step in his overall mission, she said. Do I gather that missionary work in Venezuela was not his first choice for vacation? You can gather whatever you wish. He's working directly for me, and I can be very persuasive. Jonathan issued a low whistle. You're running your own independent op? This must be really special. It is. And it goes high up the ladder? Can't go a lot higher. The White House? Irene stared back silently. Oh, wow, Jonathan said. Political intrigue didn't frighten him. In fact, it kind of excited his inner Eagle Scout. But there were levels of political intrigue that raised the stakes considerably. Finally, Irene said, I told you this is important. When you see the name I'm focused on, a name that has not been reported to the media, by the way, and who we don't think the terrorists yet know they have, you'll understand why court orders and standard investigation protocols won't work.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And thank you so much for coming on. It's been a real, honor and, thrill to have you here. The last question I like to ask everybody before we go is, I call it last call. You don't have to go, but you have to restart the video. What's one piece of advice you'd give to anyone watching today that can make, just one small thing that can make their life just a little bit better?
Listen and don't make excuses. Accept responsibility and always try to make things better.
Very good. Yeah, very good. Thank you for that. And if anyone wants to learn more about you, is there any particular way or about the book? What's the website the best, or was there anything else you'd point to?
JohnGilstrap.com is my website. John Gilstrap Author is my Facebook page, and my YouTube is Author John Gilstrap.
Thanks, everybody, for watching. It's a great conversation with John. I'm honored to have him on. We have a special question now for you. What's the most thrilling thing to ever happen in your hometown? Drop them in the comments below. John and I would love to hear them, and you will certainly get a response back. Cheers. Thanks for tuning in. The show is labor of fun, and it's truly a reward in its own right. But if you would like to support me or the other amazing authors I have on there, consider picking up a book. Any of the writers we have on here would be a great addition to your bookshelf. Each one is a master storyteller and just a great person to boot, so you'd be doing them and yourself a great favor in picking those up. And while I would never call myself a master, because that would be, as we said in the 90s, conceited, I do have one on pretty good authority from critics and my mom alike that I'm not bad. So if you wouldn't mind picking up one of my books, that would be great as well. I would appreciate it. Thanks again for watching, and thanks to my great panel of guests for coming on and spending this time with us. Cheers.